Hello, I'm in Sao Paulo today. I thought I'd like to take you through a bit more detail or a few more examples of the temporal event concept that I talked about in a prior video to make it a little bit more concrete. So let's use an example of, suppose I'm a Canadian citizen who lives on the border near the US, and I transact it with a US bank, and I have the choice of doing things either in US dollars or in Canadian currency, Canadian dollars. This makes it so that my quantitative measurement is more complex because I'm transacting in two different currencies. When I have this situation, I have to be able to manage the things that we've talked about in order to get to a true metric engine. It's not just currency that creates these sorts of conditions. There are other things that things have to be measured in the same quantitative measurements in order to be additive, in order to do calculations. If we don't do that, we have to get them to common measurements and before we do other types of calculations. But currency is a common example that's used, so we're going to use that today. So let's suppose that I take out a loan in US dollars and that I need to repay this loan over 5 months. And we'll say that the currency exchange rate between US and Canada for Canadian dollars is the Canadian dollar is strengthening. So each month, let's say that it just declines by a penny. Starts at 105, and then each month over the 5 months it's going to decline, so that at the end of the time period US dollar equals a Canadian dollar. Now what this does is that when I have to take and create certain business events, let's go through our examples that we talked about in the prior video. So the accounting events, when I take out my loan, the only thing I have, I get a single payment to me for the total amount of the loan. That doesn't reflect the debit-credit position. I have to take and translate that into a debit-credit position to reflect a loan payable and the disbursement of cash. So that changes from a single business event into multiple accounting events, because accounting events have what's called a duality associated with them. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create the accounting events off of that. Now, when it comes to making my first payment a month from when I took out my loan, then I have to take and pay that in US dollar. But I want to know what the Canadian equivalent of that is. Well, the exchange rate after 1 month on the first payment, we said, was $1.05. So when I take the US dollar and multiply it by $1.05, then I can calculate what my payment is in Canadian currency. Now, taking that and doing that each month, you'll see that each one of my transactions, each one of my payments, I've had to generate a currency translation, or I've had to convert the transaction into Canadian currencies. That's a business event. That is a conversion event, and it's only based upon the payment that I've made. It's not based upon any other data. Now, when I try to go calculate my balance, though, for this loan, I could take and add up those payments that I've made in Canadian currencies, but that doesn't reflect actually the point in time position of my loan, because effectively, as the loan declines, as the dollar declines relative to the Canadian dollar over time, the value of the loan on the last day should be equal to just the Canadian dollars. But if I take and add up the Canadian currency, the Canadian transactions, I won't get that. So there's a process here of using a balance to do what's called revaluation. Revaluation generates that there's been a change in the currency over some period of time, but that balance generates a new set of transactions, a new set of business events that have to be posted. So that's another step in the process, is these translation of business events and balance-based business events that are created. Another set of balance-based events that could be created is, let's say that in the bank that I'm banking with, they have to pay someone for the money that they've given me. There's an interest rate, the cost of funds, to them in order for them to pass it on to me at a different interest rate. That cost of fund process is something that's typically it's called transfer pricing if it's an internal intercompany mechanism, or funds transfer pricing, typically in banking. That process also can be calculated using a balance-based process of generating what the cost of funds have been for providing that loan to customers. This process, though, of generating these types of transactions, these kinds of balances, generating and determining what the cost of funds are an analytical event. We don't typically take and generate the cost of funds and then take last month's cost of funds, apply that transaction to last month's cost of funds to post this month's cost of funds. That's not the way it typically happens, because it's just not that valuable to do that kind of posting process for this kind of analysis. Rather, we tend to just generate the cost of funds as of a point in time and analyze what those costs have been as of that point in time, and then we throw away the analysis we did when we regenerate a new cost of funds. The historical transaction testing or balance progression over time just is not that valuable for this kind of analysis. So in this case, it's an analytical event, not a business event, something that we do in a snapshot sort of approach, where we generate it once, analyze that, and then it goes away. All of these kinds of examples that I've given today are things that a metric engine would have to manage, because these kinds of processes don't just exist within currency and not just within banking. It happens within many different kinds of processes when it comes to analytical, quantitative, structured data analysis. So this is one set of type of business events we need to be able to manage effectively through the process of posting and creating reports in our metric engine.